Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight, as you settle into your comfortable space, perhaps wrapped in soft blankets with the quiet darkness of evening embracing you, I invite you to travel back with me to medieval England to discover the remarkable story of one of history's most influential yet often misunderstood women, Lady Margaret Beaufort. Her name might not echo as loudly through history as some of the kings and queens she helped to shape, but without Margaret Beaufort, there would have been no Tudor dynasty, no Henry VIII, no Elizabeth I, and no golden age of English Renaissance. She was the thread that wove together the turbulent chapters of the Wars of the Roses and the peaceful prosperity of early Tudor England. Before we begin our tale, I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Have you encountered Margaret Beaufort's story before? What draws you to these quiet moments with history as you prepare for rest? Don't be shy about sharing your thoughts. Your questions and insights help shape these journeys we take together. And if you find peace in these historical narratives, please consider subscribing to join our community of fellow history lovers who find comfort in tales from the past. A gentle tap of the like button helps others discover these soothing stories too. Tonight's story spans 66 extraordinary years from Margaret's birth in 1443 during the twilight of the Middle Ages, through the devastating Wars of the Roses, to her death in 1509 as the matriarch of England's newest royal dynasty. It's a tale of survival and strategy, of maternal love so fierce it could topple kings, of faith that sustained her through the darkest trials, and of a brilliant mind that shaped the destiny of a nation. So breathe deeply, let your shoulders relax, and allow yourself to drift back 5.5 centuries to a world of stone castles and flickering candles, of royal courts and monastery bells, where our story begins in the gentle countryside of Bedfordshire, in the rolling hills of Bedfordshire, where ancient oak trees cast long shadows across meadows dotted with wildflowers, and where the river Great Ouse winds its peaceful way through fertile valleys, stands the imposing fortress of Bletsoe Castle. Its stone walls, weathered by centuries of English rain and sunshine, have witnessed the rise and fall of noble families, the celebration of births and the mourning of deaths, the signing of treaties and the plotting of rebellions. It was within these thick walls, in a chamber warmed by a crackling fire and softened by tapestries depicting scenes of courtly love and chivalric adventure, that on the last day of May in either 1441 or 1443, for even the most careful records of the time sometimes blur, a baby's cry announced the arrival of a child who would reshape England's destiny. The infant was Margaret, daughter of John Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, and his wife Margaret Beauchamp of Bletsoe. From the moment she drew her first breath, this tiny girl carried within her veins the promise and the peril of royal blood. Her father was the grandson of John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, the fourth son of the great King Edward III, making Margaret a great-great-granddaughter of England's most celebrated medieval monarch. But royal blood, as Margaret would learn throughout her long life, was both a blessing and a curse. The Beaufort line, though legitimised by Parliament, carried the stain of illegitimate origins. John of Gaunt had fathered his Beaufort children with Catherine Swynford, initially his mistress and governess to his children, from his first marriage to Blanche of Lancaster. Though John and Catherine later married, legitimising their children, the shadow of their irregular beginning would follow the family for generations. Young Margaret's early years at Bletsoe Castle were filled with the gentle rhythms of noble medieval life. The castle awakened each morning to the sound of bells calling the household to prayer, followed by the bustle of servants preparing the day's meals in the great kitchens. The air would fill with the sense of baking bread, roasting meats, and the sweet herbs that grew in the castle's walled gardens. Margaret shared her childhood with numerous half-siblings from her mother's first marriage to Oliver St. John, brothers named John and Oliver, and sisters called Edith, Mary, Margaret, and Elizabeth. These children formed a lively household, their laughter echoing through the stone corridors as they played games of hide-and-seek among the tapestries or listened to travelling minstrels tell tales of King Arthur and his knights. Her mother, Margaret Beauchamp, was a woman of remarkable intelligence and deep faith who recognized her daughter's quick mind early on. Unlike many noble girls of the time who received only basic instruction, young Margaret was taught to read and write in both English and French, to manage household accounts, and to understand the complex web of feudal obligations that bound together medieval society. Most importantly, she was instructed in the Christian faith that would become her anchor through decades of political storms. The castle's library, though modest by later standards, contained treasures that fired Margaret's imagination. Illuminated prayer books with margins decorated in gold leaf and brilliant blues and reds, chronicles of English kings, and books of hours that marked the passage of sacred time. Young Margaret would spend hours studying these volumes, her small fingers tracing the Latin words she was learning to understand, her mind absorbing the stories of saints and monarchs that would shape her understanding of power and piety. But this peaceful childhood was shattered when Margaret was barely a year old. Her father, John Beaufort, had returned to military service in France as part of England's ongoing attempts to maintain its continental empire during the final phases of the 100 Years' War. Made Duke of Somerset and appointed Captain General of Aquitaine and Normandy, John had seen this as his chance to restore the family's military honour and prove his worthiness to King Henry VI. The campaign, however, proved disastrous. John's forces, though successful in capturing some minor French towns, never engaged the main French army directly. His men pillaged freely through the French countryside, and accusations flew that John was misappropriating royal funds for his own enrichment. The French, led by King Charles VII, systematically retook the territories John had captured, making his entire expedition appear futile and costly. Returning to England in disgrace, John found that King Henry VI refused to receive him at court. The humiliation was complete and devastating. Unable to bear the shame of his failure, John Beaufort retired to his estate in Dorset, and on the 27th of May, 1444, he took his own life. Margaret was not yet 2 years old. The Duke's suicide sent shockwaves through the English nobility. Suicide was considered a mortal sin by the Church, condemning the soul to eternal damnation. The family's reputation was further tarnished, adding to the existing questions about the legitimacy of the Beaufort line. For young Margaret, this tragic beginning would cast a long shadow over her life, but it would also forge in her a determination to restore her family's honour and secure her rightful place in English society. With her father's death, Margaret became one of the wealthiest heiresses in England. She inherited not only the vast Beaufort estates in Kent, Worcestershire, Lincolnshire, Norfolk, Somerset, Essex, and Sussex, but also her mother's considerable holdings in Bedfordshire, Wiltshire, and Dorset. This immense wealth, combined with her royal bloodline, made the infant Margaret an irresistible prize for ambitious noble families seeking to advance their own fortunes. Under the feudal system of the time, wealthy orphaned minors became wards of the crown, and the king could grant their wardship to favoured nobles, who would then control their estates and, most crucially, arrange their marriages. King Henry VI, recognising Margaret's value, initially granted her wardship to William de la Pole, Earl of Suffolk, and steward of the royal household. Suffolk was one of the most powerful men in England, but also one of the most controversial. As Henry II's chief advisor, he had pursued a policy of peace with France that many nobles considered weak and treasonous. The loss of English territories in France was largely blamed on Suffolk's diplomatic approach, and his enemies whispered that he sought to use his control over wealthy wards like Margaret to advance his own family's claim to the throne. In 1450, when Margaret was about 7 years old, Suffolk arranged her betrothal to his son, John de la Pole. The marriage would unite Suffolk's political power with Margaret's royal bloodline and vast wealth, potentially creating a formidable challenge to the weak King Henry VI. But this arrangement was to prove Suffolk's undoing. Parliament, led by his political enemies, accused Suffolk of treason, claiming that he planned to use Margaret's bloodline to put his son on the throne. The charges against Suffolk grew more serious when it was alleged that he had been secretly negotiating with the French and planning to surrender more English territories. Under intense pressure, King Henry VI was forced to banish Suffolk from England for 5 years. Suffolk never reached his place of exile. As his ship crossed the North Sea toward Calais, it was intercepted by unknown attackers. Suffolk was captured, given a mock trial on the ship's deck, and beheaded. His body was left on the beaches of Dover as a warning to other nobles who might consider treasonous acts. Despite Suffolk's death, young Margaret remained betrothed to his son, John de la Pole, but her wardship was now in question. King Henry VI, facing increasing pressure from his cousin Richard, Duke of York, who questioned his right to rule and his competence as a monarch, needed to shore up support among the nobility. The king decided to grant Margaret's wardship to his own half-brothers, Edmund and Jasper Tudor. The Tudor brothers were the sons of Owen Tudor, a Welsh courtier who had secretly married Catherine of Valois, the widow of Henry V and mother of Henry VI. Though their birth was humble and their claim to nobility recent, Henry VI had legitimized his half-brothers and granted them substantial titles. Edmund became Earl of Richmond, while Jasper became Earl of Pembroke. The decision to grant Margaret's wardship to the Tudors was a stroke of political genius. It brought her immense wealth into the royal fold, while removing her from potential rebels like the Duke of York. It also provided the Tudor brothers with the financial resources they needed to maintain their newly elevated status. For Margaret, this change in guardianship would prove to be the most significant moment of her young life, though she could not have known it at the time. In February 1453, when she was nearly 10 years old, she was summoned to King Henry VI's court in London. The journey from Bletsoe Castle to Westminster would have taken several days along muddy medieval roads, but for Margaret, it must have felt like travelling to another world. The royal court was a spectacle beyond anything Margaret had experienced at quiet Bletsoe Castle. Westminster Palace buzzed with hundreds of nobles, courtiers, servants and clerks, all dressed in their finest clothes and speaking in the sophisticated accents of the court. The air was heavy with the scents of expensive perfumes, rich foods, and the smoke from countless candles and torches that lit the great halls even during the day. Margaret's marriage contract with John de la Pole was formally annulled, and she was instead betrothed to Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond. The betrothal ceremony took place in the presence of King Henry VI himself, a pale, scholarly man who seemed more comfortable discussing theology than ruling a kingdom. For Margaret, meeting the king would have been both thrilling and intimidating. This was the man appointed by God to rule England, yet he seemed so fragile and uncertain compared to the powerful nobles who surrounded him. Her first major court function came on April the 23rd, 1453, at Windsor Castle for the annual Garter celebrations. This was one of the most important events in the royal calendar, when the Knights of England's Premier Chivalric Order gathered to honour their patron saint, St. George. Margaret appeared alongside Queen Margaret of Anjou, Henry VI's formidable French wife, wearing an exquisite red dress that must have made her feel like a princess from one of the romances she loved to read. King Henry VI was so pleased with Margaret's presence at court that he gifted her 100 marks for clothing on May 12th, a substantial sum that demonstrated his favour and prepared her for her upcoming wedding to Edmund Tudor. For a 10-year-old girl who had known only the quiet rhythms of castle life, these glimpses of royal magnificence must have been overwhelming and exciting. But even as Margaret was being welcomed into the royal family through her betrothal to Edmund Tudor, the political situation in England was deteriorating rapidly. The Duke of York's criticism of King Henry's rule was gaining support among nobles frustrated by England's losses in France and the king's apparent weakness. The final straw came with the disastrous Battle of St. Chum's, Albans, on May 22, 1455, where Yorkist forces defeated the royal army and killed several prominent Lancastrian nobles, including Margaret's uncle, Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset. This battle marked the beginning of what would later be called the Wars of the Roses, though no one at the time could have imagined the decades of bloodshed that would follow. For Margaret, the immediate impact was personal and profound. With her uncle Somerset dead, Edmund Tudor became her primary protector and the guardian of her interests. Just 12 days after the Battle of St. Albans, on June 3, 1455, Margaret married Edmund Tudor in a ceremony that formally aligned her with the Lancastrian cause. She was 12 years old. Edmund was 24. The age difference, shocking by modern standards, was typical for noble marriages of the time, where political alliance mattered far more than personal compatibility or the bride's physical readiness for marriage. Edmund Tudor was described by contemporaries as handsome and charming, with the dark hair and olive complexion that suggested his Welsh heritage. He was also ambitious, intelligent, and completely devoted to his half-brother King Henry VI. For Margaret, he represented security and advancement. Marriage to the king's brother elevated her from wealthy heiress to royal in-law, providing her with protection in an increasingly dangerous political climate. The newlyweds established their household at Lamphay Palace in Pembrokeshire, Wales, a beautiful residence that had once belonged to the wealthy bishops of St. David's. The palace, with its great hall, private chambers, and walled gardens, provided a peaceful setting for the beginning of their married life. Wales in the 1450s was a wild and beautiful land of mountains and valleys, ancient castles and modern palaces, where Welsh was still the common language, and English rule was maintained through a network of loyal nobles like the Tudors. Edmund's primary responsibility in Wales was to maintain order and royal authority, particularly in the face of rebellious Welsh magnates who supported the Yorkist cause. Chief among these was Gruffudd ap Nicholas, a powerful landowner who controlled Carmarthen Castle, the most important administrative centre in South Wales. Edmund's task was to break Gruffudd's power and bring Wales firmly under royal control. For several months, Margaret and Edmund lived quietly at Lamphay, and it was during this time that their marriage was consummated and Margaret became pregnant. The young bride, despite her royal education, must have found the physical realities of marriage and pregnancy frightening and painful. Medieval medicine offered little understanding of pregnancy and childbirth, and many women died in labour. For a girl who had not yet reached her 13th birthday, the prospect of giving birth must have been terrifying. Edmund's military campaign against Gruffudd ap Nicholas initially went well. He successfully captured Carmarthen Castle in a daring assault, forcing the Welsh rebels to seek help from their Yorkist allies in England. The response came swiftly. Sir William Herbert and Sir Walter Devereux arrived in Wales with a force of 2,000 men, determined to recapture the castle and crush Edmund's small army. The battle was brief and decisive. Edmund's forces were overwhelmed, and he was captured on August 10th, 1455. For Margaret, now 6 months pregnant, the news of her husband's capture brought terror and despair. She was alone in hostile territory, surrounded by enemies who saw her unborn child as a threat to their cause. Fortunately for Margaret, medieval warfare was often more civilized than later conflicts. Edmund was held as a noble prisoner, treated with the courtesy due his rank, and there was hope that he might be ransomed or exchanged for Yorkist prisoners. Margaret spent agonizing weeks awaiting news, her pregnancy advancing while she worried constantly about her husband's fate. The news that came in early November was devastating. Edmund Tudor had died in captivity, not from violence, but from plague. The Black Death was still a recurring nightmare in medieval Europe, and the unsanitary conditions of medieval prisons made them perfect breeding grounds for disease. Margaret was now a widow at 13, 7 months pregnant, and completely alone in Wales. The terror of widowhood in medieval times was compounded by Margaret's fear that she, too, might succumb to the plague that had killed her husband. She frantically gathered every medical treatise she could find, desperately seeking information about how to protect herself and her unborn child from the disease that had claimed Edmund. Medieval medical knowledge was limited and often incorrect, but it was all she had to cling to in her desperation. Salvation came in the person of Jasper Tudor, Edmund's younger brother, who rushed to Wales as soon as he heard of his brother's death. Jasper understood immediately that Margaret and her unborn child were in mortal danger, not just from disease, but from the political enemies who surrounded them. The child Margaret carried was now potentially the heir to the Tudor name and fortune, and there were many who would benefit from its death. In mid-November 1456, as winter was setting in across Wales, Jasper escorted the heavily pregnant Margaret on the dangerous journey from Lamphy to Pembroke Castle. The journey, over rough Welsh roads in winter weather, must have been an ordeal for the young widow, but Pembroke Castle offered something that no other fortress in Wales could provide: absolute security. Pembroke Castle was one of the most formidable fortresses in Britain, built by the Norman conquerors on a rocky promontory overlooking Milford Haven. Its walls were over 20 feet thick in places, and its great round keep rose over 70 feet above the surrounding countryside. Most importantly, it had never been successfully besieged. It was the perfect place for Margaret to give birth to her child in safety. On January 28, 1457, as snow fell gently on the castle's walls and the wind howled in from the Irish Sea, Margaret went into labour in a chamber high in the castle's keep. The birth was prolonged and difficult. Her body, still more child than woman, struggled to deliver the infant who would one day wear England's crown. Medieval medicine could do little to ease her pain, and there were moments when both mother and child seemed unlikely to survive. But survive they did. As the first light of dawn broke over the Welsh coast, Henry Tudor was born, a healthy baby boy who would grow up to become Henry VII, the first Tudor King of England. Margaret, exhausted but triumphant, held her son in her arms and must have felt a fierce surge of protective love that would define the rest of her life. The birth had been traumatic, and it seems likely that Margaret suffered internal injuries that prevented her from ever having another child. Henry Tudor would remain her only child, making the bond between mother and son uniquely intense and precious. From the moment she first looked into his dark eyes, Margaret dedicated her life to protecting Henry and securing his rightful place in the world. The medieval tradition of churching required that new mothers spend 5 days, weeks in seclusion after giving birth. attended only by women and forbidden from entering churches or participating in religious ceremonies. For Margaret, these weeks at Pembroke Castle provided a precious opportunity to recover from her ordeal and bond with her infant son. She spent hours gazing at Henry's face, memorizing every feature, perhaps already dreaming of the greatness that might await him. The churching period ended with a ceremony of purification that allowed Margaret to re-enter society, but she faced an uncertain future. As a 13-year-old widow with a newborn son, she was vulnerable in ways that medieval society offered few protections against. Her vast wealth made her a target for ambitious nobles, while her son's Tudor bloodline, however distant from the throne it might seem, could be viewed as a threat by those in power. Jasper Tudor understood these dangers better than anyone. As Edmund's brother and Henry's uncle, he had a duty to protect both mother and child, but he also had his own political survival to consider. The Yorkist faction was growing stronger, and Jasper needed allies to secure his position in Wales. The solution he proposed was both practical and politically astute. Margaret should marry again, and quickly. The search for a suitable husband began in March 1457, just weeks after Henry's birth. Jasper had already identified the ideal candidate, Henry Stafford, the younger son of Humphrey Stafford, Duke of Buckingham. The Staffords were one of England's most powerful noble families, with vast estates and strong connections to the royal court. More importantly, the current Duke of Buckingham had remained neutral in the growing conflict between York and Lancaster, making his family a safe haven for Margaret and her son. The marriage negotiations required Margaret to undertake another grueling journey, this time from Pembroke to the Stafford family seat at Greenfield near Newport. That Margaret was willing to make this 100-mile journey just 2 months after giving birth demonstrates both her courage and her determination to secure her son's future. Medieval travel was difficult under the best of circumstances, but for a new mother still recovering from a traumatic birth, it must have been agony. Henry Stafford proved to be everything Jasper had hoped for in a husband for Margaret. He was intelligent, cultured, and genuinely kind, qualities that were by no means guaranteed in medieval political marriages. At 25, he was young enough to be compatible with his 13-year-old bride, but mature enough to provide the guidance and protection she needed. Perhaps most importantly, he seemed genuinely fond of Margaret and showed every indication of being willing to treat her with respect and affection. The fact that Henry Stafford was related to Margaret through their common descent from John of Gaunt and Catherine Swynford required papal dispensation for the marriage, which was granted on April 6, 1457. After Margaret completed the customary year of mourning for Edmund Tudor, the wedding took place on January 3, 1458, at Stafford's estate. The wedding ceremony itself would have been a modest affair compared to royal weddings, but it marked the beginning of what appears to have been a genuinely happy marriage. Unlike many medieval political unions that remained coldly formal throughout their duration, Margaret and Henry Stafford developed what seems to have been real affection for each other. They celebrated their wedding anniversary every year with special feasts, a custom that suggests their marriage brought them both pleasure rather than mere political convenience. Life with the Staffords provided Margaret with something she had never experienced before: stability and security. The family's principal residence was at Bourne in Lincolnshire, but they also maintained properties throughout the Midlands. Margaret found herself mistress of comfortable households where she could practice the skills her mother had taught her, managing servants, overseeing agricultural estates, and maintaining the complex financial records that kept noble households functioning. But even in this peaceful environment, Margaret's thoughts constantly turned to her son Henry, who remained at Pembroke Castle under Jasper Tudor's protection. Medieval noble families routinely separated parents from children at young ages. Boys were often sent to other noble households to serve as pages and learn the skills of knighthood, while girls might be raised by future in-laws to prepare them for marriage. But for Margaret, who had already lost so much in her short life, the separation from her only child was a source of constant anxiety. Henry was often sickly as a child, suffering from various illnesses that kept Margaret in a state of perpetual worry. Medieval medicine had no understanding of childhood diseases, and infant mortality rates were horrifyingly high, even among the wealthy. Margaret spent considerable sums on medicines and physicians for Henry, and she maintained a constant correspondence with Jasper Tudor to stay informed about her son's health and development. The letters between mother and son, carefully preserved in Jasper's household, provide glimpses into their relationship during these early years. Margaret's letters were filled with maternal advice and expressions of love, while Henry's responses, dictated to scribes when he was very young and later written in his own hand, show a child who understood the special bond he shared with his mother. Even at a young age, Henry seems to have grasped that his survival and success depended on maintaining this connection. As Margaret settled into her life as Lady Stafford, the political situation in England continued to deteriorate. King Henry VI suffered what appears to have been a mental breakdown in 1453, leaving him catatonic and unable to govern. Richard, Duke of York, was appointed protector of the realm during the king's illness, giving him effective control of the government. When Henry VI recovered his sanity in 1455, he attempted to reassert his authority, leading to the Battle of St. Albans and the beginning of open warfare. The conflict that would become known as the Wars of the Roses was initially seen by many as just another noble quarrel that would soon be resolved. Medieval England had experienced numerous baronial revolts and power struggles throughout its history, and there was no reason to expect this one to be different. But the underlying issues were more serious than previous conflicts. Questions about the legitimacy of Henry VI's rule, the competence of his government, and the succession to the throne created divisions that could not be easily healed. For Margaret and her family, the key was to navigate these dangerous waters without taking sides too obviously. The Staffords' strategy was to maintain nominal loyalty to King Henry VI, while avoiding any actions that might provoke retaliation from the Yorkists. This delicate balancing act required considerable diplomatic skill, and Margaret proved surprisingly adept at the subtle arts of political survival. The death of Margaret's father-in-law, the Duke of Buckingham, at the Battle of Northampton in July 1460, brought both grief and opportunity to the family. Buckingham had been one of King Henry's most loyal supporters, dying in defense of his king when Yorkist forces captured Henry and forced him to name Richard, Duke of York, as his heir. The Duke's death was a blow to the Lancastrian cause, but it also freed his son Henry Stafford from any obligation to continue the family's militant support for Henry VI when Queen Margaret of Anjou raised an army in Scotland and defeated the Yorkists at the Battle of Wakefield in December 1460, killing Richard, Duke of York, and his son Edmund, Earl of Rutland. It seemed for a moment that the Lancastrian cause might triumph. Margaret and Henry Stafford must have felt relief that their cautious neutrality had kept them safe during this latest reversal of fortune. But their relief was short-lived. Richard, Duke of York's eldest son, Edward, proved to be a far more capable military leader than his father had been. At the Battle of Towton on March 29, 1461, fought in a blizzard on the Yorkshire moors, Edward's army inflicted a crushing defeat on the Lancastrians. King Henry VI and Queen Margaret fled to Scotland, effectively ending their reign, and Edward was crowned Edward IV on June 28, 1461. For Margaret, Edward IV's victory brought both relief and terror. Relief because the new king proved to be remarkably forgiving to former enemies. Rather than embarking on a reign of terror, Edward chose to pardon most Lancastrian nobles who were willing to submit to his authority. Henry Stafford and his younger brother John, who had fought against Edward at Towton, were pardoned on June 25, 1461, and their estates were restored. But Margaret's terror was focused on her son Henry, whose guardian Jasper Tudor was branded a traitor and forced to flee to Scotland. 4-year-old Henry Tudor, now the most prominent remaining representative of the Lancastrian cause in Wales, was made a ward of Sir William Herbert, the same man who had captured and indirectly caused the death of Henry's father, Edmund Tudor. The irony was bitter, but Herbert proved to be a decent guardian. Perhaps recognizing the child's innocence in the political struggles of adults, Herbert treated Henry kindly and provided him with an excellent education at Raglan Castle. Herbert's wife, Anne Devereux, took a particular interest in the boy's welfare, treating him almost as one of her own children. This kindness would not be forgotten. When Henry Tudor became king decades later, he welcomed Anne Devereux at his court and treated her with special honor in recognition of her care during his childhood. Still, the separation from her son was agonizing for Margaret. Edward IV had not only stripped Henry of his titles and lands, giving the young boy's inheritance to his own brother George, Duke of Clarence, but had also made it clear that Henry would remain a ward of the crown for the foreseeable future. Margaret could visit her son occasionally, but these visits were rare and closely supervised. Throughout the 1460s, Margaret demonstrated the political skills that would serve her so well in later life. Rather than openly opposing Edward IV or plotting his overthrow, she chose to work within the new system, gradually building relationships with Yorkist nobles and proving her loyalty to the new regime. This strategy required her to swallow considerable pride. She had to smile graciously at the men who had defeated her cause and killed her allies, but it was the only way to secure her family's survival. Margaret's political acumen was tested severely when some of her own relatives chose different paths. Her cousin Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, initially submitted to Edward IV and was received favourably at court. But in 1463, Somerset changed his mind and rejoined the Lancastrian cause, leading a failed rebellion that ended with his death at the Battle of Hexham in 1464. Margaret learned from Somerset's fate that consistency and patience were more valuable than dramatic gestures. By 1466, Margaret's careful cultivation of Yorkist favour began to pay dividends. Edward IV granted her the manor of Woking in Surrey, which had previously belonged to her father and had been confiscated after his suicide. The grant was a sign that Margaret was no longer viewed as a political threat, and it provided her with a comfortable country retreat where she could live quietly with Henry Stafford. Woking Palace, as it came to be known, became Margaret's favourite residence during these peaceful years. Set in the Surrey countryside, surrounded by gardens and orchards, it offered a welcome respite from the tensions of court life. Margaret and Henry could walk in the gardens, attend services at the local church of St. Peter, and take day trips to nearby towns like Guildford for shopping and entertainment. Margaret even took up hunting and hawking, traditional noble pastimes that helped her fit in with her New Yorkist neighbours. Despite her comfortable circumstances, Margaret never forgot her ultimate goal, securing her son's return and the restoration of his inheritance. She continued to correspond with Henry regularly, sending him books, clothing, and other gifts that reminded him of her love and care. More importantly, she used her growing influence with the Yorkist court to gradually improve Henry's situation. In September 1467, Margaret made the journey to Raglan Castle to visit Henry for a week. This appears to have been her first extended visit with her son in several years, and it must have been an emotional reunion for both of them. Henry was now 10 years old, tall for his age, with the dark hair and serious demeanour that would characterise him as an adult. Margaret would have been both proud of how well he was growing up and heartbroken at how much of his childhood she had missed. The relationship between Margaret and Henry's guardians, the Herbert family, was complex. While she was grateful for their kindness to Henry, she must also have felt jealous of the time they spent with her son and the influence they had over his development. William Herbert had paid King Edward IV £1,000 for the privilege of being Henry's guardian, a sum equivalent to about £650,000 today, and he naturally expected to profit from the arrangement through control of Henry's lands and eventual marriage. Margaret's opportunity to impress the king himself came in December 1468, when Edward IV visited the Stafford estates. Margaret spared no expense in preparing for this royal visit, purchasing a luxurious red dress for herself and organising an elaborate 5-course meal featuring the finest seafood, exotic spices, and the most skilled musicians in the region. She even constructed a purple hunting tent where the king could rest during his visit. The visit appears to have been a success, demonstrating Margaret's loyalty to the Yorkist regime at a time when Edward IV's own position was becoming precarious. The king's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville, a widow of relatively humble origins, had offended many of his supporters, particularly his former ally Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, who felt that Edward should have married a foreign princess to secure international alliances. The growing rift between Edward IV and the Earl of Warwick had serious implications for Margaret and her son. In July 1469, Warwick raised a rebellion against the king, and Henry Tudor, accompanying his guardian William Herbert, was present at the Battle of Edgecote, where Herbert was defeated and captured. Margaret must have been frantic with worry when news of the battle reached her, fearing that her son might have been killed alongside his guardian. To her relief, Henry had survived the battle and had been taken to safety at Wibley Castle by Anne Devereux. But William Herbert was not so fortunate. He was executed by Warwick's men, leaving Henry's guardianship in question once again. Margaret immediately travelled to London to petition for custody of her son, but her request was denied. Henry remained a royal ward, though his day-to-day care was now entrusted to Anne Devereux and her family. The political upheavals of 1469 to 1470 created opportunities for the exiled Lancastrians to attempt a comeback. In October 1470, the Earl of Warwick, now calling himself the Kingmaker, succeeded in restoring Henry VI to the throne in what became known as the readeption. Margaret's joy at this unexpected turn of events must have been overwhelming. Not only was her original king restored, but she was finally reunited with her son after years of separation. The meeting between Margaret, Henry, and the restored King Henry VI took place at Westminster on October 27, 1470. It must have been a deeply emotional moment for Margaret to see the man who had arranged her marriage to Edmund Tudor and who had been forced to flee his kingdom now returned in triumph. More importantly, Henry VI seemed pleased to meet Edmund Tudor's son and immediately confirmed that Henry would return to his uncle Jasper's guardianship. For Margaret, the next month was the happiest she had experienced in years. Henry came to stay with her at Woking Palace, and they spent 2 precious weeks together exploring the Surrey countryside, sharing meals, and reconnecting after their long separation. Margaret could see how her 11-year-old son had grown and developed during their time apart, and Henry could finally experience the maternal love that had been denied him for so long. But this happiness was tragically brief. On April 11, 1471, Edward IV returned from exile and marched on London to reclaim his throne. The restoration of Henry VI had never been popular among the common people, who remembered Edward IV's reign as a time of relative peace and prosperity. Edward was welcomed back into London with enthusiasm, and Henry VI was once again imprisoned in the Tower. The final confrontation came at the Battle of Tewkesbury on May 4th, 1471, where Edward IV decisively defeated the Lancastrian forces. In the aftermath of the battle, the young Prince Edward of Lancaster, son of Henry VI and heir to the throne, was killed, either during the fighting or executed shortly afterward. Queen Margaret of Anjou was captured and later ransomed back to France, while the unfortunate Henry VI was murdered in the Tower of London on May 21st, 1471. The extinction of the direct Lancastrian line changed everything for Margaret and her son. With the deaths of Henry VI and his son, the Lancastrian claim to the throne passed to the descendants of Edward III through the female line. Margaret, as the senior representative of the Beaufort line, could now argue that her son Henry Tudor had a legitimate claim to the throne of England. But this theoretical claim was also incredibly dangerous. Edward IV, now securely restored to his throne, would not tolerate any potential rivals. Margaret's immediate priority was to get Henry to safety before the king could capture him. Working with Jasper Tudor, she arranged for Henry and his uncle to flee England before Edward IV's agents could apprehend them. In October 1471, Henry and Jasper set sail from Wales, intending to seek refuge in France, but a storm in the English Channel drove their ship off course, and they were forced to land in Brittany instead. Duke Francis II of Brittany, moved by compassion for the young exile and perhaps seeing political advantage in harbouring a potential claimant to the English throne, granted Henry and Jasper sanctuary at his court. For Margaret, her son's escape was both a relief and a new source of anguish. Henry was safe from Edward IV's vengeance, but he was also farther away from her than he had ever been. The English Channel now separated them, and any communication would have to be conducted in secret, through trusted messengers who risked their lives carrying letters between England and Brittany. The autumn of 1471 brought Margaret another devastating loss. Her husband Henry Stafford, who had been wounded fighting for Edward IV at the Battle of Barnet, succumbed to his injuries on October 2nd. The man who had given Margaret 13 years of happiness and stability was gone, leaving her a widow once again at the age of 28. Henry Stafford's death was not just a personal tragedy for Margaret, it was also a political crisis. As a widow, she was once again vulnerable to the schemes of ambitious nobles who might seek to control her wealth through marriage. Edward IV, despite his recent victory, still faced threats to his throne, and he could not afford to leave such a wealthy and well-connected widow unattached. Margaret understood the precarious nature of her situation perfectly. Within months of Henry Stafford's death, she had arranged her third marriage, this time to Thomas Stanley, one of the most powerful nobles in northern England. Stanley was a pragmatic politician who had survived the Wars of the Roses by carefully avoiding firm commitments to either side. He was also wealthy, influential, and well-connected at Edward IV's court. The marriage to Thomas Stanley, which took place on June 12, 1472, was purely a matter of political convenience for both parties. Margaret gained the protection of Stanley's name and influence, while Stanley acquired control of her vast estates and the prestige of marrying into a royal bloodline. There seems to have been little personal affection between them, but they understood each other perfectly and worked together effectively to advance their mutual interests. As Lady Stanley, Margaret found herself closer to the centre of political power than she had ever been before. Stanley held important positions at court, including the role of steward of the royal household, giving Margaret regular access to the king and queen. She used this access skillfully, gradually rebuilding her reputation and demonstrating her loyalty to the Yorkist regime. Throughout the 1470s, Margaret played a dangerous double game. Publicly, she was the perfect courtier, elegant, well-educated, and appropriately deferential to royal authority. She attended court functions, participated in ceremonies, and gave every appearance of being a loyal subject of Edward IV. But privately, she maintained secret communications with her son in Brittany, sending him money, information, and maternal guidance through a network of trusted agents. These communications had to be extraordinarily careful. Edward IV had spies throughout Europe, and any evidence that Margaret was plotting against the king could result in her execution for treason. The letters were written in code, carried by merchants and pilgrims who appeared to have innocent reasons for travelling between England and Brittany. Margaret's servants were chosen for their absolute loyalty, and even they knew only small pieces of the larger picture. Margaret's correspondence with Henry reveals the depth of her maternal devotion and her political acumen. She advised him to be patient, to avoid any rash attempts to return to England, and to distrust Edward IV's occasional offers of pardon and safe passage. These offers, Margaret correctly suspected, were traps designed to lure Henry back to England, where he could be easily captured and eliminated. Henry, for his part, seems to have deeply respected his mother's judgment. When Duke Francis II of Brittany, under pressure from Edward IV, agreed in 1476 to hand Henry over to English agents, it was Henry's quick thinking and his mother's warnings that saved him. Feigning illness, Henry took sanctuary in a church near the French border and ultimately escaped to France proper, where he could be certain of protection from English influence. By 1480, Margaret's position at the Yorkist court had improved significantly. She was trusted enough to carry Edward IV's youngest daughter, Bridget, to her christening, a high honour that demonstrated the king's confidence in her loyalty. Margaret had also been building relationships with other powerful women at court, including the Queen, Elizabeth Woodville, whose own family had risen from relatively humble origins to royal status. Margaret's careful cultivation of these relationships paid unexpected dividends when her mother, Margaret Beauchamp, died in 1482. The inheritance included not only substantial lands and wealth, but also the possibility of negotiating Henry Tudor's return to England. After months of delicate negotiations, Margaret secured Edward IV's agreement that Henry could return and claim his grandmother's inheritance, provided he swore loyalty to the crown. A document dated June 3rd, 1482, bore Edward IV's seal and promised that if Henry returned to England, he would be in the grace and favour of the King's Highness. For Margaret, this agreement represented the culmination of more than a decade of patient work. Her son would finally be able to come home, reclaim at least part of his birthright, and perhaps even be restored to some of his former titles. But fortune, which had so often disappointed Margaret in the past, was about to deal her another crushing blow. On April 9, 1483, Edward IV died suddenly at the age of 40, probably from a stroke or heart attack brought on by his increasingly dissolute lifestyle. The agreement for Henry's return died with the king, leaving Margaret's carefully laid plans in ruins. Edward IV's unexpected death plunged England into a succession crisis that would give Margaret Beaufort the opportunity she had been waiting for her entire life. The late king's heir was his 12-year-old son, Edward V, but the boy's youth and the unpopularity of his mother's family among the nobility created an opening for ambitious rivals. The most immediate threat came from within the royal family itself. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, Edward IV's younger brother, had served loyally throughout his brother's reign and was named protector of the realm during his nephew's minority. But Richard had his own supporters who believed he would be a better ruler than a child king dominated by the Woodville family. The political maneuvering began almost immediately. Elizabeth Woodville, now the Dowager Queen, tried to maintain control over her son and ensure a smooth transition of power. But Richard of Gloucester, supported by powerful nobles who resented the Woodvilles' rapid rise to power, moved quickly to isolate the young king from his maternal relatives. The confrontation came to a head in April 1483 when Richard intercepted the 12-year-old Edward V at Northampton as the boy was travelling from Wales to London for his coronation. Claiming to be protecting his nephew from the corrupting influence of the Woodvilles, Richard took custody of the king and arrested several of his maternal relatives, including his uncle Anthony Woodville, Earl Rivers. Elizabeth Woodville, recognizing the danger, immediately fled to Westminster Abbey with her younger children, including her 9-year-old son, Richard, Duke of York. The sanctuary laws of the medieval church meant that even kings could not violate the sacred precincts of the abbey to seize their enemies, giving the former queen temporary protection. But Richard of Gloucester was not deterred by such legal niceties. Using a combination of threats and persuasion, he convinced Elizabeth Woodville to surrender her younger son, promising that Richard, Duke of York, would simply join his brother in comfortable apartments in the Tower of London, while preparations for the coronation continued. The Tower of London, in the 15th century, was both a royal residence and a fortress. Kings had lived there for centuries, and it was not unusual for royal children to stay in the tower while awaiting important ceremonies. But as the weeks passed, and Richard of Gloucester made increasingly bold moves to consolidate power, it became clear that the two young princes were not being prepared for a coronation, but were being held as prisoners. On June 22, 1483, Richard made his intentions clear. In a sermon at St. Paul's Cathedral, his supporter, Ralph Shah, proclaimed that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid, making all their children illegitimate and ineligible for the throne. The evidence for this claim was flimsy. It relied on the assertion that Edward had been previously contracted to marry another woman before his wedding to Elizabeth, but it provided the legal justification Richard needed. 4 days later, an assembly of nobles and clergy formally petitioned Richard to take the throne, claiming that the kingdom needed a strong adult ruler rather than a disputed child king. Richard accepted their petition with apparent reluctance, and on July 6, 1483, he was crowned Richard III in Westminster Abbey. For Margaret Beaufort, watching these events unfold from her position at court, Richard's usurpation represented both danger and opportunity. Danger because her son Henry Tudor, with his Lancastrian bloodline, could be seen as an alternative to the unpopular new king, but also opportunity because Richard's seizure of the throne had created widespread discontent among the nobility, particularly among former supporters of Edward IV, who felt betrayed by Richard's actions. The immediate question was what had happened to the two young princes in the tower. Richard III claimed that they were being cared for in royal apartments, but they had not been seen in public since their father's funeral, and rumours began to circulate that they had been murdered. These rumours were impossible to verify. The tower was one of the most secure fortresses in England, and access to the royal apartments was strictly controlled. But whether the princes were dead or alive, their disappearance from public view fundamentally changed the political situation. If they were dead, then the Yorkist claim to the throne might be said to have passed to their sister Elizabeth of York, Edward IV's eldest daughter. If they were alive but permanently imprisoned, then their sister might still be considered the rightful heir to her father's throne. It was this possibility that sparked Margaret's imagination and drove her to the most audacious gambit of her political career. If her son Henry Tudor could marry Elizabeth of York, uniting the rival claims of Lancaster and York, he might be able to present himself as the rightful King of England with support from both formerly warring factions. The idea was brilliant in its simplicity, but incredibly dangerous to execute. Margaret would have to secretly negotiate with Elizabeth Woodville, who was still in sanctuary at Westminster Abbey, to secure her agreement to the marriage. She would also have to build a network of supporters willing to risk their lives in rebellion against Richard III, and she would have to coordinate with her son in Brittany to prepare for an invasion of England. The key to approaching Elizabeth Woodville was Margaret's trusted physician, Dr. Lewis of Caerleon, a Welshman who could pass freely between the royal court and the sanctuary at Westminster Abbey on the pretext of treating patients. Through Dr. Lewis, Margaret was able to convey her proposal to the former Queen. Henry Tudor would return to England, claim the throne, and marry Elizabeth of York, thereby legitimizing both the Tudor claim and restoring the Yorkist line. Elizabeth Woodville's response was swift and positive. The former Queen, consumed with grief and rage over the fate of her sons and the usurpation of her family's rights, saw in Margaret's proposal a chance for revenge against Richard III. More importantly, marriage to Henry Tudor offered her daughter Elizabeth the possibility of becoming queen in her own right, rather than remaining a political pawn in Richard's court. With Elizabeth Woodville's agreement secured, Margaret began the delicate work of building a conspiracy against Richard III. She started with her own family connections, reaching out to former servants of Edward IV, who had been displaced by Richard's usurpation. Many of these men had personal grievances against the new king and were willing to risk rebellion for the chance to restore what they saw as the rightful royal line. Among Margaret's earliest recruits were Giles Daubeney, Richard Guilford, Thomas Ramney, and John Cheney, all experienced soldiers and administrators who had served Edward IV faithfully and felt betrayed by Richard's seizure of power. These men brought with them their own networks of supporters, creating the foundation of what would become a formidable conspiracy. But Margaret's most important recruit was also her most surprising, Henry Stafford, 2nd Duke of Buckingham, who had been one of Richard III's closest supporters during his rise to power. Buckingham was Margaret's former stepson. His father had been married to Margaret's second husband, Henry Stafford, and he had initially supported Richard's claim to the throne with enthusiasm. What changed Buckingham's mind remains one of the great mysteries of the period. Some historians suggest that he was horrified by Richard's treatment of the young princes and could no longer support a king he believed to be a child murderer. Others argue that Buckingham had his own claim to the throne through his descent from Edward III and saw an opportunity to advance his own interests. Still others believe that Margaret herself was responsible for turning Buckingham against Richard through a combination of persuasion and manipulation. Whatever his motives, Buckingham's support was crucial to the conspiracy's chances of success. As one of the most powerful nobles in Wales and the Welsh Marches, Buckingham could provide the military force necessary to hold territory, while Henry Tudor landed from Brittany. His presence also gave the rebellion legitimacy. It was no longer just a Lancastrian plot, but a movement that included prominent Yorkist nobles who had turned against Richard III. Throughout the summer of 1483, Margaret worked tirelessly to coordinate the various elements of the conspiracy. Messages had to be smuggled to her son in Brittany, informing him of the plot and urging him to prepare for an invasion. Supporters throughout England had to be contacted and their participation secured. Most importantly, the timing had to be perfect. Henry's landing had to coincide with uprisings throughout England to prevent Richard III from concentrating his forces against any single threat. The plan that emerged was ambitious in scope. Buckingham would raise his forces in Wales and march toward London, drawing Richard's attention westward. Simultaneously, supporters in Kent and the south would rise in rebellion, proclaiming Edward V and Richard Duke of York as the rightful kings and demanding their release from the Tower. While Richard was distracted by these multiple threats, Henry Tudor would land on the south coast with a small army provided by the Duke of Brittany and march inland to join forces with the other rebels. The signal for the rebellion to begin was set for October 18, 1483. But like so many of Margaret's carefully laid plans, this one was destined to be frustrated by circumstances beyond her control. The first sign of trouble came when Richard III learned of the conspiracy earlier than expected. The king had an efficient network of spies, and the scale of the rebellion made it difficult to keep completely secret. On October 11th, Richard issued a proclamation declaring Buckingham a traitor and offering rewards for his capture. The Duke's rebellion was exposed before it had even begun. Buckingham, committed to the cause, and perhaps hoping that momentum would overcome the early exposure of the plot, proceeded with his planned uprising. On October 18th, as agreed, he raised his standard in Wales and began marching toward England with a force of several thousand men. But his timing could not have been worse. Wales was experiencing some of the worst weather in living memory. Torrential rains had swollen the rivers beyond their banks, making travel nearly impossible, and communication between different rebel groups extremely difficult. Buckingham's army, bogged down by mud and harassed by royal forces, began to disintegrate even before it could engage the enemy in battle. Meanwhile, Henry Tudor had set sail from Brittany with a small fleet, carrying about 3,000 men, including 500 Breton soldiers provided by Duke Francis II. But when Henry's ships approached the English coast near Plymouth, they were met not by friendly forces, but by royal troops displaying Richard III's banners and calling for Henry to come ashore and accept the king's pardon. Henry, perhaps warned by his mother's letters to be suspicious of Richard's offers, sensed a trap. Instead of landing, he ordered his fleet to return to Brittany, leaving the English rebels to face Richard III's forces without the foreign support they had been promised. The failure of Henry's invasion sealed the fate of the other conspirators. Without the promised Tudor forces, the various rebellions throughout England collapsed one by one. Buckingham, abandoned by his followers and hunted by royal troops, was captured at Wem in Shropshire on November 1st, 1483. He was executed the next day in the marketplace at Salisbury, becoming the most prominent victim of the failed rebellion. For Margaret, the failure of the Buckingham conspiracy was a catastrophe that threatened not only her political ambitions, but her very life. Her role in organizing the rebellion was well known to Richard III, and the penalty for treason was death, even for women of noble birth. That she escaped execution was due primarily to her marriage to Thomas Stanley, whose support Richard desperately needed to maintain his grip on power. Stanley had carefully remained neutral during the rebellion, claiming ignorance of his wife's activities while avoiding any actions that might be construed as supporting either side. This strategic ambiguity allowed him to maintain his position at court, while protecting Margaret from the full consequences of her treason. But Richard III was not inclined to be completely forgiving. In January 1484, Parliament passed an Act of Attainder against Margaret, stripping her of all her titles, lands, and legal rights. Her vast estates were transferred to Thomas Stanley for the good and faithful service that he had done unto us, effectively making Margaret dependent on her husband's goodwill for her very survival. More humiliating than the loss of her property was Margaret's placement under house arrest. She was forbidden to communicate with her son or anyone else outside England, and her movements were restricted to Stanley's properties. For a woman who had spent decades building political networks and carefully cultivating relationships throughout the nobility, this isolation was perhaps the cruelest punishment Richard III could have devised. But even under house arrest, Margaret's political instincts remained sharp. She understood that Richard III's position was fundamentally weak. His usurpation had created enemies throughout the nobility, and rumors about the fate of the young princes continued to damage his reputation. The failed Buckingham Rebellion had been a setback, but it was not the end of Margaret's ambitions. Working through Thomas Stanley, who maintained his position at Richard's court, while secretly sympathizing with his wife's cause, Margaret continued to gather intelligence about political developments in England. She learned that Richard's own son and heir, Edward of Middleham, was sickly and might not survive to inherit the throne. She also learned that Richard's queen, Anne Neville, was unable to bear more children, creating uncertainty about the royal succession. Most importantly, Margaret learned that discontent with Richard's rule was growing rather than diminishing. The king's attempts to win popular support through acts of generosity and displays of piety were undermined by persistent rumors about his role in the disappearance of his nephews. Many nobles who had initially accepted Richard's kingship were beginning to wonder whether they had made a mistake. Meanwhile, in Brittany, Henry Tudor was using the time provided by his mother's house arrest to build support for a second invasion attempt. The failure of the Buckingham Rebellion had taught him valuable lessons about the need for better coordination and more reliable intelligence. He also recognized that his claim to the throne would be strengthened if he could present himself not just as a Lancastrian claimant, but as the leader of a broader coalition opposed to Richard III's rule. On Christmas Day, 1483, in the cathedral at Rennes, Henry Tudor made a public pledge that would define the rest of his political career. Before an assembly of English exiles and Breton nobles, he swore a solemn oath that if he successfully claimed the throne of England, he would marry Elizabeth of York, uniting the houses of Lancaster and York and bringing peace to the war-torn realm. This pledge was both a political masterstroke and a personal commitment that would shape Henry's entire reign. By promising to marry Elizabeth of York, he was offering former Yorkist supporters a path back to political relevance, while simultaneously legitimizing his own claim to the throne through marriage to Edward IV's daughter. For Margaret, news of her son's oath must have brought both pride and anxiety. Pride because Henry was demonstrating the political sophistication she had tried to instill in him through years of secret correspondence. Anxiety because the oath committed him to a course of action that would inevitably lead to another confrontation with Richard III, and this time there might be no opportunity for escape if the invasion failed. Throughout 1484, Margaret watched from her enforced isolation as Richard III's position continued to deteriorate. The death of his son Edward in April was a devastating blow to the king's hopes for establishing a lasting dynasty. Queen Anne Neville's declining health raised questions about whether Richard would remarry and attempt to father new heirs, creating additional uncertainty about the succession. Perhaps most damaging to Richard's reputation were the persistent rumors that he was planning to marry his own niece, Elizabeth of York. These rumors, whether true or false, horrified many of Richard's supporters and lent credence to the accusations that he had murdered Elizabeth's brothers to clear his own path to the throne. By early 1485, Margaret could sense that the political tide was turning in her son's favor. Intelligence from her network of supporters suggested that many nobles who had initially supported Richard were now having second thoughts. The king's attempts to strengthen his position by distributing lands and titles to his followers had only created resentment among those who felt they deserved similar rewards. Most encouragingly, Margaret learned that several of Richard's most important supporters were secretly communicating with Henry Tudor's agents, exploring the possibility of changing sides when the next invasion came. Even some members of the Stanley family, despite Thomas Stanley's outward loyalty to Richard, were believed to be sympathetic to Henry's cause. As spring turned to summer in 1485, Margaret could feel the approaching climax of her life's work. Her son was preparing to return to England, backed by French gold and supported by a growing network of English nobles who had lost faith in Richard, the boy she had given birth to in Pembroke Castle. 28 years earlier, was about to claim his birthright and establish a new dynasty that would rule England for more than a century. The invasion fleet that set sail from Harfleur on August 1st, 1485, carried not just Henry Tudor's military hopes, but also Margaret's dreams of vindication. For nearly 3 decades, she had endured humiliation, exile and defeat in pursuit of her son's rightful place on the throne. Now, as Henry's ships crossed the English Channel toward their destiny, Margaret could only wait and pray that this time, fortune would finally favour the House of Tudor. On August 7th, Henry Tudor landed at Milford Haven in Wales, the same region where his father Edmund had died and where he himself had been born. As his small army marched inland, gathering supporters with each mile, Margaret must have felt that the circle of her life was finally closing. The child who had entered the world in a Welsh castle during a winter storm was returning as a man to claim his kingdom. The two armies met at Market Bosworth on August 22nd, 1485, in a battle that would determine the fate of England. Richard III, despite having a larger army and more battlefield experience, faced enemies on all sides. Many of his nobles were wavering in their loyalty, and some, including Margaret's own husband Thomas Stanley, were actively communicating with Henry Tudor's forces. The battle itself was brief but decisive. When Thomas Stanley's forces finally entered the fighting on Henry Tudor's side, Richard III's army collapsed. The king himself, fighting bravely to the end, was struck down in a marshy area at the edge of the battlefield. His crown, supposedly found on a thorn bush, was placed on Henry Tudor's head by Lord Stanley himself. For Margaret, the news of her son's victory must have been almost overwhelming. After decades of struggle, sacrifice and patient planning, Henry VII was King of England. The Beaufort claim to the throne, tainted by illegitimacy and weakened by defeat, had finally triumphed. Margaret was no longer a traitor under house arrest, but the mother of England's rightful sovereign. But even in her moment of triumph, Margaret's practical political instincts remained sharp. Victory in battle was only the beginning. Henry would need to consolidate his power, win the loyalty of former enemies, and establish the Tudor dynasty on secure foundations. For Margaret, this meant that her work was far from over. The skills in diplomacy, negotiation, and political manipulation that had served her so well during the dark years of exile would now be needed to help her son rule successfully. As Henry VII entered London in triumph and prepared for his coronation, Margaret began planning for the next phase of their shared political journey. The boy she had protected through 2 decades of exile was now king, but the woman who had made his victory possible was ready to help him transform military conquest into lasting political success. The news of Henry Tudor's victory at Bosworth Field reached Margaret while she remained under house arrest at one of Thomas Stanley's estates. According to contemporary accounts, her first reaction upon hearing of her son's triumph was not joy, but tears. Tears of relief, certainly, but also tears of apprehension. For Margaret understood better than most that winning a crown in battle was far easier than keeping it. Her fears were not without foundation. English history was littered with kings who had won their thrones through military victory, only to lose them to rival claimants or rebellious nobles. The Wars of the Roses had seen the crown change hands multiple times within living memory, and Margaret knew that her son's hold on power would remain precarious until he could prove himself as an effective ruler. But for the moment, the immediate threat had passed. Richard III was dead, his army was scattered, and Henry Tudor was being acclaimed as Henry VII throughout England. More personally significant for Margaret was the end of her house arrest and the restoration of her freedom to act as she chose. The woman who had spent nearly 2 years forbidden to communicate with her son was finally free to play an active role in establishing the new regime. Henry VII's first act upon securing London was to date his reign from August 21st, 1485, the day before the Battle of Bosworth. This legal fiction meant that all those who had fought for Richard III could technically be branded as traitors, giving the new king powerful leverage over potential enemies. But Henry chose to use this power sparingly, understanding that wholesale revenge would only create more enemies and perpetuate the cycle of violence that had plagued England for decades. Instead of rushing to London to claim his throne, Henry made a decision that revealed both his political wisdom and his deep affection for his mother. He chose to spend his first weeks as king at Woking Palace in Surrey, the comfortable country estate where Margaret had lived happily with Henry Stafford decades earlier. This was the same place where mother and son had shared 2 precious weeks together in 1470, before Edward IV's return had forced Henry into 15 years of exile. The reunion between Margaret and Henry at Woking must have been profoundly emotional for both of them. Margaret was now 42 years old, her hair grey and her face marked by decades of worry and political struggle. Henry was 28, no longer the 11-year-old boy who had bid her farewell so many years ago, but a man seasoned by years of exile and the recent crucible of battle. Yet despite the passage of time and the dramatic changes in their circumstances, the bond between mother and son remained as strong as ever. Contemporary accounts describe how Henry insisted that Margaret take precedence over all other nobles in his presence, and how he consulted her on every major decision during those early days of his reign. For Margaret, after decades of working behind the scenes and through intermediaries, it must have been deeply satisfying to finally exercise direct influence over English politics. Henry's first Parliament, which convened on November 7, 1485, demonstrated his determination to reward his mother for her decades of loyal service and political acumen. The Act of Resumption not only restored all of Margaret's confiscated lands and titles, but also granted her an unprecedented degree of legal and political independence. She was declared a femme sole, meaning that she could manage her own affairs without requiring her husband's consent or approval. This legal status was virtually unknown in medieval England, where married women were normally considered to be under their husband's legal authority in all matters. By granting Margaret femme sole status, Henry was acknowledging both her exceptional abilities and her crucial role in his rise to power. More practically, it meant that Margaret could not be held responsible for her husband's actions, nor could Thomas Stanley claim control over her vast estates. The wealth that this legal independence placed at Margaret's disposal was staggering by the standards of the time. Her annual income was estimated at over £3,000 per year, equivalent to several million pounds in modern terms, making her one of the richest individuals in England. This wealth gave her the resources to maintain her own household, fund her political activities, and pursue the charitable and educational projects that would define her later years. But perhaps more important than her wealth was the unique position Margaret now occupied in the new Tudor regime. She was not merely the king's mother, but his closest advisor and most trusted confidant. Henry had learned during his years of exile to rely on Margaret's political judgment, and he continued to seek her counsel on all major decisions throughout his reign. This relationship was formalized through Margaret's assumption of the title My Lady the King's Mother, a designation that had no precedent in English royal protocol, but which perfectly captured her unique status. She was granted robes and regalia that matched those of a queen, and in court ceremonies, she walked only half a pace behind the actual queen consort, Elizabeth of York, whom Henry married on January 18, 1486, in fulfillment of his oath at Rennes Cathedral. The relationship between Margaret and her daughter-in-law Elizabeth has often been portrayed as antagonistic in popular culture, with Margaret depicted as a domineering mother-in-law who resented sharing influence with a younger woman. But the historical evidence suggests a more complex and generally collaborative relationship between the two women. Elizabeth of York, the daughter of Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville, was 20 years old when she married Henry VII. She had spent her adolescence under the shadow of political upheaval, witnessing her father's death, her brother's disappearance, and her uncle's usurpation of the throne. Her marriage to Henry was undoubtedly a political arrangement, but contemporary accounts suggest that genuine affection developed between the royal couple over time. For Margaret, Elizabeth represented both an opportunity and a challenge. On the one hand, Elizabeth's presence at court helped legitimize Henry's reign by demonstrating the union of the rival houses of Lancaster and York. Her beauty, grace, and royal bloodline made her an ideal queen consort who could help win the loyalty of former Yorkist supporters. On the other hand, Elizabeth's youth and royal breeding made her a potential rival for influence over Henry. Margaret had grown accustomed to being her son's primary advisor during his years of exile, and she may have been reluctant to share that role with anyone else, even Henry's wife. The solution that Margaret and Elizabeth worked out appears to have been a division of responsibilities that allowed both women to exercise significant influence within their respective spheres. Margaret focused primarily on political matters, using her extensive network of contacts and her deep understanding of noble politics to help Henry navigate the complexities of governing England. Elizabeth, meanwhile, concentrated on court ceremonial, diplomatic relations, and the all-important task of producing heirs to secure the Tudor succession. This division of labour proved remarkably effective. Margaret's political advice helped Henry avoid many of the pitfalls that had destroyed previous kings, while Elizabeth's success as a mother, she gave birth to 7 children, including the future Henry VIII, provided the dynasty with the biological security it needed to survive. The collaborative relationship between the two women was perhaps most clearly demonstrated in their joint planning of royal marriages for Henry and Elizabeth's children. Both women understood that strategic marriages were crucial to establishing the Tudor dynasty on the European stage and securing England's position among the great powers of the continent. When it came time to arrange the marriage of Arthur, Prince of Wales, to Catherine of Aragon, daughter of the Spanish monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella, both Margaret and Elizabeth worked together to ensure the success of the negotiations. Margaret's diplomatic experience and Elizabeth's royal connections proved invaluable in navigating the complex protocols of international royal marriages. Margaret took particular interest in preparing Catherine of Aragon for her life in England, even going so far as to specify in her letters that the Spanish princess should learn to drink wine rather than water, since English water was often contaminated and unsafe. This attention to practical details, combined with her broader strategic thinking, exemplified Margaret's approach to political problems throughout her life. The early years of Henry VII's reign were marked by several attempts to overthrow the new dynasty, and Margaret played a crucial role in helping her son survive these challenges. The most serious threat came from Lambert Simnel, a young man who who was passed off as Edward, Earl of Warwick, son of George Duke of Clarence, and thus a potential Yorkist claimant to the throne. The Simnel conspiracy was supported by several powerful nobles who had not reconciled themselves to Henry's rule, as well as by foreign enemies, including the Irish nobles and German mercenaries. When Simnel's supporters invaded England in 1487, Margaret used her network of contacts to gather intelligence about their movements and plans, providing Henry with crucial information that helped him defeat the rebels at the Battle of Stoke Field. Margaret's intelligence network, built up over decades of political activity, proved to be one of Henry's most valuable assets during these early challenges to his authority. Her agents provided information not only about domestic conspiracies, but also about foreign plots and the activities of Yorkist exiles in Europe, who continued to scheme against the Tudor regime. Perhaps more importantly, Margaret's political wisdom helped guide Henry's response to these threats. Rather than responding to rebellion with mass executions and confiscations, Henry followed his mother's advice to show mercy to defeated enemies, while taking practical steps to prevent future conspiracies. This approach helped break the cycle of revenge and counter-revenge that had characterized the Wars of the Roses. The most persistent threat to Henry's reign came from Perkin Warbeck, who claimed to be Richard, Duke of York, the younger of the two princes who had disappeared in the Tower of London under Richard III. Warbeck's claim was supported by several European rulers, including Margaret of Burgundy, who had been Edward IV's sister and who never accepted Henry VII's legitimacy. The Warbeck conspiracy lasted for nearly a decade, from 1491 to 1499, and at times posed a serious threat to Henry's throne. But once again, Margaret's political acumen proved invaluable. She helped Henry understand that the key to defeating Warbeck was not just military victory, but also diplomatic isolation, cutting off the pretender's sources of foreign support and gradually undermining his credibility among potential English supporters. Margaret's approach to the Warbeck threat demonstrated the sophisticated understanding of power politics she had developed over decades of experience. Rather than advising Henry to respond with brute force, she counseled patience and careful manipulation of international relationships. She understood that European rulers supported Warbeck not because they believed in his claim, but because they saw him as a useful tool for weakening England. By the late 1480s, Margaret had established herself as one of the most powerful and influential women in English history. Her wealth, political connections, and unique position as the king's mother gave her an authority that few nobles could match. But rather than using this power solely for personal aggrandizement, Margaret began to turn her attention to projects that would create a lasting legacy beyond the political success of the Tudor dynasty. The transformation of Margaret Beaufort from political conspirator to royal matriarch was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of her later life. After decades of operating in the shadows, communicating through secret agents and coded messages, she now found herself at the very center of English political life, consulted on every major decision, and treated with a deference that bordered on reverence. Her daily routine at court reflected this unprecedented status. Margaret maintained her own household within the royal palaces, complete with her own servants, chaplains, and administrative staff. Her chambers were furnished with the finest tapestries, illuminated manuscripts, and works of art that money could buy. Visitors to court quickly learned that an audience with My Lady the King's mother was often as important as a meeting with the king himself. But Margaret's power was not merely ceremonial. Henry VII genuinely relied on his mother's political judgment, particularly in matters involving the complex web of noble relationships that defined English politics. Margaret's decades of experience in navigating these relationships combined with her encyclopedic knowledge of family connections and old grievances, made her an invaluable advisor to a king who had spent his formative years in foreign exile. Contemporary accounts describe how Margaret would rise before dawn each day to attend religious services in her private chapel. These morning prayers were not merely pious observances, but also opportunities for Margaret to plan her day and consider the political challenges facing the Tudor regime. The discipline and focus that had sustained her through decades of political struggle now served her well in the demanding role of royal advisor. After her morning prayers, Margaret would typically spend several hours reviewing correspondence and meeting with various petitioners, nobles, and royal officials. Her ability to remember names, family connections, and past favors made these meetings remarkably efficient. She could quickly assess the political implications of various requests and provide Henry with shrewd advice about which petitions to grant and which to defer. Margaret's influence extended far beyond domestic politics. As the mother of England's king, she played a crucial role in diplomatic relationships with other European powers. Foreign ambassadors quickly learned that winning Margaret's support could be as important as gaining the king's ear, and she used this leverage to advance English interests in international negotiations. The Spanish marriage negotiations that would eventually bring Catherine of Aragon to England as Arthur's bride demonstrated Margaret's diplomatic skills at their finest. She understood that the success of the marriage would depend not just on political agreements between the English and Spanish crowns, but also on the personal compatibility between the young couple and their ability to adapt to each other's cultural expectations. Margaret took personal responsibility for ensuring that Catherine would be properly prepared for life in England. She insisted that the Spanish princess learn French, which was still the language of international diplomacy, and she provided detailed instructions about English court customs and expectations. Most famously, she advised that Catherine should become accustomed to drinking wine rather than water, since English water was often contaminated and could cause serious illness. These may seem like minor details, but they reflected Margaret's understanding that successful political alliances depended on countless small considerations as well as grand strategic planning. Her attention to practical matters helped ensure that Catherine's transition to English court life went smoothly, contributing to the overall success of the Spanish alliance. Margaret's relationship with her grandchildren was another source of both personal joy and political responsibility. As the children of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York grew up, Margaret took an active role in their education and development, understanding that these young people would be crucial to the Tudor dynasty's long-term survival. Her eldest grandson, Arthur, Prince of Wales, was the heir to the throne, and thus the focus of particularly intense attention. Margaret ensured that Arthur received the finest possible education, bringing in leading scholars to tutor him in languages, literature, history, and political theory. She also took care that he was trained in the practical skills of kingship, including military tactics, diplomatic protocol, and the complex art of managing noble relationships. Margaret's influence on Arthur's education reflected her own intellectual interests and accomplishments. By this stage of her life, she had become one of the most learned women in England, with particular expertise in religious literature and historical chronicles. Her personal library, carefully assembled over decades, contained works in Latin, French, and English, covering theology, philosophy, history, and literature. But Margaret's intellectual pursuits were not merely personal hobbies. She understood that learning and scholarship were powerful tools for establishing the Tudor dynasty's legitimacy and cultural authority. By patronizing scholars, commissioning translations, and founding educational institutions, she was creating a cultural framework that would support and justify Tudor rule for generations to come. Her youngest grandson, Henry, Duke of York, the future Henry VIII, seems to have been a particular favorite. perhaps because his robust health and confident personality reminded Margaret of her own determined character. Contemporary accounts describe how Margaret delighted in watching the young prince practice his martial skills, and how she took pride in his precocious intelligence and charismatic personality. Margaret's gift-giving to her grandchildren reflected both her personal affection and her understanding of their future roles. To Arthur, she gave books on history and political theory that would help prepare him for kingship. To Henry, she presented weapons, armor, and sporting equipment that would help him develop the physical skills expected of a royal prince. To her granddaughter Margaret, she offered jewelry and fine clothing that would help establish her status as a marriageable royal princess. But perhaps Margaret's most important legacy to her grandchildren was her example of how to exercise power effectively and responsibly. Through her own conduct, she demonstrated that true authority came not from inherited titles or military force, but from intelligence, dedication, and the careful cultivation of relationships based on mutual respect and benefit. As Margaret entered her 60s, she began to think more seriously about her ultimate legacy. The Tudor dynasty was secure, her son was an effective king, and her grandchildren were healthy and well educated. But Margaret wanted to ensure that her influence would extend beyond her own lifetime, creating institutions and traditions that would benefit England long after she was gone. This desire for lasting impact led Margaret to focus increasingly on educational and religious patronage. She understood that England's long-term prosperity and stability would depend on having educated clergy, competent administrators, and learned scholars who could serve the crown and the church effectively. By investing in education, she was investing in England's future. The University of Cambridge became the primary focus of Margaret's educational philanthropy. Cambridge, in the late 15th century, was a small but growing institution that had the potential to become a major centre of learning, comparable to the great universities of Paris and Bologna. But realizing this potential would require significant financial investment and careful institutional development. Margaret's first major project at Cambridge was the refounding of God's House as Christ's College in 1505. God's House had been established in 1439 as a training college for schoolmasters, but it had fallen into decline and needed substantial renovation and endowment to fulfill its educational mission effectively. Margaret's transformation of God's House into Christ's College was far more than a simple renovation project. She completely redesigned the college's curriculum, bringing in leading scholars from across Europe to serve as fellows and lecturers. She also provided substantial endowments that would ensure the college's financial stability for centuries to come. The buildings that Margaret commissioned for Christ's College reflected her vision of what a university should be. The college featured comfortable residential quarters for students and fellows, a magnificent library to house scholarly works, and a beautiful chapel where the academic community could worship together. These buildings were designed not just to be functional, but also to inspire learning and scholarship through their beauty and grandeur. Margaret took particular pride in the college's library, which she stocked with the finest manuscripts and printed books available. Her own collection of religious and historical works formed the nucleus of the library, and she continued to acquire new books throughout her life to ensure that Cambridge scholars would have access to the latest developments in learning and scholarship. But Margaret's educational vision extended beyond individual colleges to encompass the entire university system. She understood that England needed not just more educated clergy, but also more competent administrators, diplomats, and professionals who could serve the growing needs of the Tudor state. To meet this need, she established the Lady Margaret Professorships of Divinity at both Oxford and Cambridge. These professorships were revolutionary innovations in English higher education. unlike traditional university posts that focused on narrow technical training, the Lady Margaret professorships were designed to produce scholars who could engage with the great intellectual and spiritual questions of their time. The professors were expected to be not just teachers, but also original thinkers who could contribute to the advancement of human knowledge. Margaret's choice of John Fisher as the first Lady Margaret Professor at Cambridge reflected her excellent judgment in identifying scholarly talent. Fisher was not only a brilliant theologian and philosopher, but also a gifted administrator who understood Margaret's vision for transforming Cambridge into a world-class university. Under his guidance, Cambridge began to attract students and scholars from across Europe, establishing a reputation for excellence that continues to this day. The success of Margaret's educational initiatives at Cambridge encouraged her to undertake an even more ambitious project, the foundation of St. John's College. This second college was designed to complement Christ's College by focusing specifically on training clergy who could serve the spiritual needs of England's growing population. St. John's College was Margaret's most personal educational project. She worked closely with John Fisher to design every aspect of the college, from its curriculum and governance structure to the architectural details of its buildings. The college was intended to be her monument, a lasting testament to her commitment to learning and her faith in education as a force for social improvement. The foundation of St. John's College also reflected Margaret's understanding of the changing religious landscape of early 16th century Europe. The Catholic Church was facing increasing challenges from reformist movements, and Margaret believed that England needed well-educated and spiritually committed clergy who could respond effectively to these challenges while maintaining orthodoxy and stability. Margaret's educational patronage was complemented by her support for the new technology of printing, which was revolutionizing the dissemination of knowledge throughout Europe. She became a patron of William Caxton, England's first printer, and later supported his successor Wynkyn de Worde in producing affordable books that could reach a much wider audience than expensive hand-copied manuscripts. Her first commission from Caxton in 1483 had been the printing of Blanchardin et Églantine, a French romance that she selected because its plot paralleled the secret marriage negotiations she was conducting between her son, Henry, and Elizabeth of York. This choice revealed Margaret's sophisticated understanding of how literature could be used to shape public opinion and cultural attitudes. But Margaret's interest in printing extended far beyond political propaganda to encompass serious scholarly and religious works. She personally undertook the translation of several important religious texts from French and Latin into English, making these works accessible to a broader audience of English readers who lacked formal education in classical languages. Her translation of Thomas à Kempis's The Imitation of Christ was particularly significant. This devotional work had become one of the most popular religious texts in Europe, but it was available only in Latin, limiting its readership to educated clergy and nobles. Margaret's English translation made this influential work available to merchants, artisans, and other members of the growing literate middle class. The quality of Margaret's translations demonstrated her own impressive linguistic abilities and literary sensibilities. She was not content simply to produce literal word-for-word translations, but instead worked to capture the spirit and meaning of the original texts, while adapting them to the rhythms and idioms of English prose. Her translations were praised by contemporary scholars for their accuracy and elegance. Margaret's translation work also reflected her deep personal piety and her commitment to making religious knowledge more widely available. She believed that England's spiritual health depended on having an informed and devout population who could understand and practice their faith intelligently rather than simply following religious rituals by rote. This commitment to religious education was also evident in Margaret's support for preaching and parish education. She established and funded positions for preachers who would travel throughout England delivering sermons in English rather than Latin, ensuring that even illiterate members of the population could understand and benefit from religious instruction. The preachers that Margaret supported were carefully selected for their learning, piety, and ability to communicate effectively with ordinary people. They were expected to be not just eloquent speakers, but also moral exemplars who could inspire their audiences through their own conduct as well as their words. Margaret's religious patronage extended beyond education and preaching to include substantial support for church building and renovation projects throughout England. She funded the construction of new churches in areas where population growth had outpaced ecclesiastical provision, and she provided money for the repair and beautification of existing churches that had fallen into disrepair. These building projects reflected Margaret's understanding that religious faith needed physical spaces that could inspire worship and foster community feeling. The churches that she funded were designed to be not just functional places of worship, but also beautiful spaces that would lift the spirits of congregants and remind them of the glory of God. Margaret's church patronage also had practical political benefits for the Tudor regime. By supporting local churches throughout England, she was demonstrating the dynasty's commitment to the spiritual welfare of its subjects, while also creating networks of grateful clergy and parishioners who would remember Tudor generosity in their prayers and their political loyalties. As Margaret entered her final decade, she began to spend more time at Collyweston Palace in Northamptonshire, which became her primary residence after 1499. This comfortable country palace allowed her to maintain a degree of independence from court life, while still remaining accessible to those who sought her counsel and support. Collyweston Palace was more than just a private residence. It was the centre of Margaret's own political and administrative network. She maintained a substantial household there, complete with her own council, secretaries, and financial officers. This household rivaled the king's own court in its size and sophistication, reflecting Margaret's status as one of the most powerful individuals in the realm. From Collyweston, Margaret continued to exercise significant influence over English politics and society. She corresponded regularly with nobles throughout England, offering advice on family disputes, property matters, and political questions. Her opinions were sought on everything from marriage negotiations to ecclesiastical appointments, and her recommendations carried enormous weight with Henry VII and his advisors. Margaret's household at Collyweston also became a centre for scholarly and cultural activity. She maintained an extensive library there and regularly hosted gatherings of learned clergy, university scholars, and literary figures who would engage in discussions about theology, philosophy, and current affairs. These gatherings helped establish Collyweston as one of the most intellectually stimulating environments in early Tudor England. The daily routine at Collyweston reflected Margaret's personal values and priorities. Each day began with religious services in the palace chapel, where Margaret would pray for her family, her realm, and her own spiritual development. These morning prayers were followed by meetings with her household staff to review correspondence, manage her estates, and plan various charitable and educational projects. Margaret's afternoons were often devoted to reading and study. Despite her advanced age and numerous responsibilities, she remained intellectually curious and continued to acquire new books for her library. She was particularly interested in historical chronicles and theological treatises, but she also enjoyed reading contemporary literature and staying informed about intellectual developments throughout Europe. In the evenings, Margaret would often entertain guests at dinner, using these occasions to gather information about political developments and to maintain her network of relationships throughout English society. Her dinner parties were famous for their excellent cuisine, stimulating conversation, and the careful attention Margaret paid to seating arrangements and protocol details that could have political implications. Throughout her time at Collyweston, Margaret never forgot her primary responsibility as the King's mother and closest advisor. She maintained regular correspondence with Henry VII, offering advice on both major policy questions and minor administrative matters. Her letters reveal a woman who remained deeply engaged with political affairs, even as she approached her 70s. Margaret's influence during this period extended beyond domestic politics to include significant involvement in diplomatic affairs. Foreign ambassadors regularly sought audiences with her at Collyweston, understanding that her opinions could influence Henry VII's decisions on international matters. She played particularly important roles in maintaining England's relationships with Spain and France, using her diplomatic skills to help navigate the complex alliance systems of early 16th century Europe. As the new century dawned in 1500, Margaret Beaufort had already achieved more than most people could dream of in several lifetimes. She had survived the chaos of civil war, engineered the rise of a new dynasty, and established herself as one of the most powerful and influential women in English history. But at 57, Margaret was entering the final phase of her remarkable life, a period that would be marked by both personal tragedy and lasting achievement. The death of her grandson Arthur, Prince of Wales, on April 2nd, 1502, was a devastating blow that shook the Tudor dynasty to its foundations. Arthur had married Catherine of Aragon just 5 months earlier in a magnificent ceremony that seemed to herald a bright future for the royal house. His sudden death from what was probably tuberculosis or typhus left the succession in doubt and plunged Margaret into deep grief. For Margaret, Arthur's death was not just a personal loss, but also a political catastrophe. She had invested enormous time and energy in the young prince's education and development, seeing in him the promise of a brilliant reign that would secure the Tudor dynasty for generations. Arthur had shown every sign of becoming an effective king. He was intelligent, well-educated, and possessed the combination of gravity and charisma that Margaret believed essential for successful royal leadership. The grief that Margaret felt over Arthur's death was compounded by her concern for the dynasty's future. With Arthur gone, the succession passed to his younger brother Henry, who was not yet 11 years old. While Henry showed promise, he was physically robust, intellectually gifted, and already displaying the confident personality that would characterize his later reign. He was still a child, and children were vulnerable in ways that Margaret understood all too well from her own experience. Margaret's response to this crisis demonstrated the same combination of emotional resilience and political pragmatism that had sustained her throughout her life. While allowing herself to grieve privately for her beloved grandson, she immediately began working to ensure that the dynasty would survive this setback. Her first priority was to secure young Henry's position as heir apparent and to begin preparing him for the responsibilities he would inherit. The education program that Margaret designed for the future Henry VIII reflected her understanding of what qualities a 16th century king would need to possess. Unlike the bookish Arthur, Henry showed more interest in physical activities and martial pursuits, so Margaret ensured that his education included extensive training in arms, horsemanship, and other skills that would help him project an image of kingly strength and competence. But Margaret also insisted that Henry receive a thorough grounding in languages, literature, and theology, understanding that effective kingship required intellectual sophistication as well as physical prowess. She personally supervised his lessons in Latin, French, and theology, often testing his progress and offering corrections and encouragement. Margaret's influence on young Henry's development extended beyond formal education, to include lessons in the practical arts of politics and leadership. She would often bring him to witness meetings with foreign ambassadors, sessions of the Royal Council, and other occasions where he could observe how power was exercised effectively. These experiences gave Henry an understanding of royal authority that would serve him well when he inherited the throne. The relationship between Margaret and her younger grandson appears to have been particularly close and affectionate. Contemporary accounts describe how Margaret delighted in Henry's quick wit and strong personality, while Henry seems to have appreciated his grandmother's attention and guidance. This close relationship would have lasting consequences for Henry's reign, as many of the policies and attitudes he would later adopt as king can be traced back to lessons learned from Margaret during his youth. Margaret's grief over Arthur's death was deepened by the subsequent death of her daughter-in-law Elizabeth of York in 1503. Elizabeth died just 9 days after giving birth to a daughter who lived only briefly, leaving Henry VII devastated and the royal household in mourning. For Margaret, Elizabeth's death meant the loss of a woman who had become a valued partner in managing the complexities of court life and royal politics. With Elizabeth of York gone, Margaret became the undisputed leading woman at court, a position that brought both opportunities and responsibilities. She now had primary influence over the education and development of her surviving grandchildren, but she also had to manage the diplomatic and ceremonial functions that Elizabeth had previously handled. Margaret rose to these challenges with her characteristic determination and intelligence. She took personal charge of arranging the marriage of her granddaughter, Margaret Tudor, to James IV of Scotland, understanding that this alliance would help secure England's northern border, while potentially uniting the English and Scottish crowns in future generations. The negotiations for Margaret Tudor's marriage demonstrated Margaret Beaufort's diplomatic skills at their finest. She understood that the success of the alliance would depend not just on the formal treaty terms, but also on the personal relationship that would develop between the young couple. She insisted that Margaret Tudor receive extensive preparation for her new role as Queen of Scotland, including instruction in Scottish customs and political relationships. Margaret Beaufort's influence on her granddaughter's education reflected her understanding that royal women needed to be prepared for more than ceremonial roles. She ensured that Margaret Tudor was trained in the arts of diplomacy, correspondence, and political analysis that would enable her to serve effectively as a bridge between the English and Scottish courts. The wedding of Margaret Tudor and James IV in 1503 was one of the last great ceremonial occasions that Margaret Beaufort would organise. The magnificent festivities that accompanied the marriage demonstrated the Tudor dynasty's wealth and power while celebrating the union of the two kingdoms. For Margaret, the wedding represented both a personal triumph and a diplomatic achievement that would have lasting consequences for British history. But even as Margaret celebrated her family's successes, she was increasingly aware of her own mortality. By 1504, when she turned 61, she was experiencing the health problems that inevitably came with age in an era when medical knowledge was limited and life expectancy was short. She began to spend more time on religious observances and charitable works, preparing for the spiritual transition that awaited her. Margaret's deepening religious devotion during her final years was not a retreat from worldly affairs, but rather a culmination of the faith that had sustained her throughout her life. She had always been devout, but her later piety had a more intense and personal quality that reflected her growing awareness of her own mortality and her desire to ensure her soul's salvation. In 1499, Margaret had taken a formal vow of chastity, effectively ending her marital relationship with Thomas Stanley, while remaining technically married to him. This vow allowed her to live independently at Collie Weston, while Stanley maintained his own residence elsewhere. The arrangement suited both parties. Stanley was able to pursue his own interests without interference, while Margaret gained the freedom to focus entirely on her religious and charitable works. Margaret's vow of chastity was witnessed by John Fisher, who had become her closest spiritual advisor and confessor. Fisher understood Margaret's complex character better than anyone else and helped guide her spiritual development during these crucial final years. Their relationship was based on mutual respect and intellectual compatibility, as well as spiritual affinity. Under Fisher's guidance, Margaret's charitable works became more focused and systematic. Rather than simply giving money to various causes as opportunities arose, she began to develop comprehensive programs that would address England's most pressing social and spiritual needs. Her educational initiatives at Cambridge were part of this larger vision of social improvement through learning and religious instruction. Margaret's daily routine during her final years reflected her priorities and values. She would rise before dawn for private prayer and meditation, followed by attendance at Mass in her private chapel. The mornings were typically devoted to correspondence and meetings with various petitioners and advisors, while the afternoons were reserved for reading and study. Margaret's reading during this period focused primarily on religious and devotional works, but she also continued to follow political developments and maintained an extensive correspondence with nobles throughout England and Europe. Her letters from this period reveal a woman who remained intellectually sharp and politically astute, even as her physical strength began to decline. The death of Thomas Stanley in 1504 marked another significant transition in Margaret's life. While their marriage had been primarily a political arrangement, Stanley's death left Margaret truly independent for the first time in her adult life. She was now free to dispose of her vast wealth entirely as she chose, without needing to consider any husband's interests or wishes. Margaret used this freedom to accelerate her charitable and educational projects. The foundation of St. John's College at Cambridge, which had been planned for several years, finally moved forward with substantial funding from her estates. She also increased her support for parish churches throughout England and expanded her program of scholarships for promising students who lacked the financial resources to pursue university education. But Margaret's greatest concern during these final years was the health and well-being of her son, Henry VII. The king, now in his late 40s, was beginning to show signs of the illness that would eventually kill him. Margaret's maternal instincts, which had driven her throughout her life, were now focused on ensuring that Henry received the best possible care, while also preparing for the transition to Henry VIII's reign. When Henry VII fell seriously ill in 1507, Margaret immediately travelled to Richmond Palace to nurse her son personally. Contemporary accounts describe how she took charge of the royal household during the king's illness, managing both his medical care and the administrative functions that could not be interrupted even during a health crisis. Margaret's behaviour during her son's illness revealed the depth of her devotion to him and her understanding of her role as the dynasty's matriarch. She understood that Henry VII's death would create both opportunities and dangers for the Tudor family, and she worked tirelessly to ensure that the transition to Henry VIII's reign would proceed smoothly. The king's recovery in 1507 brought temporary relief, but Margaret understood that it was only a reprieve. She began to make more detailed preparations for her own death, updating her will regularly and making specific provisions for the completion of her various charitable projects. She also began to transfer some of her responsibilities to other family members and trusted advisors, ensuring that her work would continue even after she was gone. Margaret's will, as it evolved during her final years, reflected both her spiritual concerns and her practical understanding of how wealth and power functioned in Tudor England. She made substantial bequests to religious institutions throughout the country, funded the completion of St. John's College at Cambridge, and provided for the maintenance of various charitable programs she had established. But Margaret also used her will to influence political developments after her death. She made specific provisions for the education and support of her grandchildren, particularly Henry VIII, and she established trusts that would provide ongoing funding for the governmental and diplomatic activities that had been central to her political career. When Henry VII's final illness began in early 1509, Margaret once again travelled to Richmond Palace to be with her son during his last days. The king died on April 21st, 1509, leaving Margaret devastated but determined to fulfill her final responsibilities to the Tudor dynasty. Margaret's grief over Henry VII's death was profound and genuine, but she did not allow personal sorrow to interfere with the practical tasks that needed to be accomplished. As the senior member of the royal family and the person named as principal executor of Henry VII's will, she took charge of the funeral arrangements, while also managing the delicate political transition to Henry VIII's reign. The funeral of Henry VII was a magnificent affair that demonstrated both the deceased king's achievements and the continuing strength of the Tudor dynasty. Margaret personally supervised every detail of the ceremony, from the elaborate hearse that carried Henry's body through London to the solemn Requiem Mass at Westminster Abbey. But even as she mourned her son's death, Margaret was already working to ensure Henry VIII's successful accession to the throne. She used her extensive network of political contacts to secure the loyalty of potentially wavering nobles, while also providing guidance and support to the 18-year-old new king as he assumed his royal responsibilities. Henry VIII's marriage to Catherine of Aragon on June 11, 1509, was largely arranged by Margaret, who understood the political importance of continuing the Spanish alliance while also providing the new king with a suitable consort. The wedding, which took place just weeks after Henry VII's death, demonstrated the dynasty's stability and continuity during a potentially vulnerable transition period. Margaret's final public appearance came at the joint coronation of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon on June 24, 1509. Despite her advanced age and declining health, she insisted on attending this crucial ceremony, understanding that her presence would help legitimize the new reign and provide continuity with the previous generation. The coronation was a magnificent spectacle that showcased the wealth and power of the Tudor dynasty. Margaret, wearing robes that matched those of a queen and carrying herself with the dignity that had characterized her entire career, played a prominent role in the ceremonies. For those who witnessed the event, her presence provided a visible link between Henry VIII's reign and the remarkable woman who had made it possible. But the effort of attending the coronation exhausted Margaret's remaining strength. According to contemporary accounts, she became ill almost immediately after the ceremony, possibly from food poisoning caused by eating contaminated swan meat at the coronation feast. By June 28th, Henry VIII's 18th birthday, she was clearly dying. Margaret faced her approaching death with the same combination of practical planning and spiritual preparation that had characterized her entire life. She made her final confession to John Fisher, received the last sacraments of the church, and said goodbye to her family and closest friends. Contemporary accounts describe her as being completely lucid and at peace during her final hours. On the morning of June 29, 1509, as John Fisher was celebrating Mass in her presence, Margaret Beaufort died, just as the priest was elevating the host during the consecration. According to witnesses, her last sight on earth was of the sacred elements that represented her deepest religious beliefs. Margaret was buried with great ceremony in Westminster Abbey, in the Henry VII chapel that her son had built as a monument to the Tudor dynasty. Her tomb, created by the Italian sculptor Pietro Torrigiano, features a magnificent bronze effigy showing Margaret in her widow's robes, her hands raised in prayer, and her face reflecting the intelligence and determination that had defined her character. The Latin inscription on Margaret's tomb, written by the great humanist scholar Erasmus, summarizes her remarkable achievements. Margaret, Countess of Richmond, mother of Henry VII, grandmother of Henry VIII, who donated funds for 3 monks of this abbey, a grammar school in Wimborne, a preacher in the whole of England, 2 lectures in scripture, one at Oxford, the other at Cambridge, where she also founded 2 colleges, one dedicated to Christ and the other to St. John, the Evangelist. But perhaps Margaret's most lasting legacy was not captured in any inscription or monument. Through her intelligence, determination, and unwavering commitment to her family's success, she had transformed the Tudors from obscure Welsh exiles into England's ruling dynasty. The boy she had protected through decades of civil war had become king, and his son was now poised to become one of the most famous monarchs in English history. Margaret Beaufort's story reminds us that history is shaped not just by the famous battles and grand political events that capture popular attention, but also by the patient work of individuals who understand that lasting change requires careful planning, persistent effort, and the courage to pursue seemingly impossible goals despite overwhelming obstacles. As we reach the end of our journey through Margaret's remarkable life, we can see how her story illuminates some of the most important themes in human history. The power of maternal love to overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles, the importance of education and learning in creating lasting social change, the complex relationship between personal ambition and public service, and the ways in which individual determination can alter the course of nations. Margaret Beaufort lived through one of the most turbulent periods in English history, witnessing the collapse of medieval feudalism and the emergence of the modern state system that would dominate European politics for centuries to come. Through her intelligence, adaptability, and unwavering focus on long-term goals, she not only survived these dramatic changes, but helped to shape them in ways that would benefit England for generations. Her founding of Christ's College and St. John's College at Cambridge created institutions that continue to educate leaders and scholars more than 5 centuries after her death. Her support for printing and translation made knowledge more widely available throughout English society. Her diplomatic achievements helped establish England as a major European power capable of competing with France and Spain on equal terms. But perhaps most importantly, Margaret's example demonstrates that effective leadership requires more than just political skill or military prowess. Her greatest achievements came from her ability to inspire loyalty and trust in others, her commitment to principles larger than her own immediate interests, and her understanding that true power comes from service to others rather than domination over them. As you prepare for sleep this evening, consider the lessons that Margaret Beaufort's life offers to all of us. Her story reminds us that even in the darkest circumstances, patience and persistence can triumph over seemingly impossible odds. It shows us that true success comes not from achieving our own goals, but from creating opportunities for future generations to build upon our work. And it demonstrates that the most lasting monuments to human achievement are not the buildings we construct or the wealth we accumulate, but the knowledge we preserve and the institutions we create to serve the common good. Margaret Beaufort died as she had lived, with dignity, purpose, and an unshakable faith that her life had been spent in service to something greater than herself. In the quiet moments before sleep, we might all aspire to approach our own challenges with even a fraction of her courage, intelligence, and unwavering commitment to the future. What aspects of Margaret's story resonate most deeply with you? Her resilience in the face of repeated setbacks, her ability to transform personal tragedy into political triumph, her dedication to education and learning as forces for social progress, I would love to read your thoughts in the comments below, and I encourage you to share this story with others who might find inspiration in Margaret's remarkable journey from vulnerable child to the matriarch of a dynasty. If these gentle explorations of history have provided you with the peaceful content you are seeking as you prepare for rest, please consider subscribing to our channel and sharing these stories with others who might benefit from their calming influence. Until we meet again for another journey through the past, may your dreams be filled with the wisdom of ages and the courage to face whatever challenges tomorrow may bring. Sleep peacefully, dear listeners, and remember that even the most ordinary among us possess the potential to achieve extraordinary things when we combine determination with compassion, intelligence with integrity, and personal ambition with service to the greater good. The story of Margaret Beaufort proves that with patience, persistence, and faith in the future, even the most impossible dreams can become reality. Good night, and may your rest be as peaceful as the final prayers of the remarkable woman whose story we have shared together this evening.